Up in the high hollows of the Blue Ridge, a girl could be handed over the way you'd hand over a heifer or a sack of seed corn, and no one in the valley would say a word against it. When I was 18 years old, a man who called himself a holy thing stood between me and the only door I had ever known, and I understood that I had exactly two choices left in this life. I could lie down in his bed and be smothered slow, the way two women before me had been smothered, or I could run into the cold black timber where the law of men ended and only the law of the mountain remained. I chose the mountain. This is what happened to me there, and I have never told it plain until now. The year was 1888, and the place was Hollow Creek, a fog-bound notch in the western North Carolina ranges, where the sun didn't reach the valley floor until near 10 in the morning and left it again by 4. It was a poor place and a frightened place. 40 families scratched corn and beans out of the steep red dirt, and every last one of them owed something to the church, and the church was Deacon Cyrus Vance. I should be careful how I tell about him, because folks who never met a man like that don't believe such men are real. He was near 60, tall and dry as a fence rail, with a voice that poured out smooth and warm as melted tallow. He had buried 2 wives in the churchyard, both young, both gone quick of a wasting sickness that no doctor was ever called to look at. He owned the meeting house and the grist mill and the only store, and he held the paper on every mortgage in the hollow. When a man fell behind, the deacon did not send for the sheriff. He prayed over him, and somehow, after the praying, that man's land would belong to the church, and the family would stay on and work it as tenants, grateful to be allowed to stay at all. Everybody in Hollow Creek owed the deacon. That was how he liked it. My father had been the one man he could not get a hold of. Daddy was a surveyor, a man who read books and measured the world with a brass chain and wrote down what he found in a leather field book, and he held a clear federal deed to the best bottomland in the valley. Daddy died when I was 16. They said he slipped on the wet rocks above the falls and broke his neck, and I believed it, because I was a child and grief does not ask questions. 2 years later, my mother lay coughing her lungs out in our cold cabin, and the church paper for our winter flour and our seed and our medicine had grown into a debt we could never pay. That is when the deacon came to the cabin and sat by my mother's bed and told her that the Lord had laid a thing on his heart. The debt would be forgiven, every cent of it, and my mother would be cared for in her last days like a queen. He asked only one thing in return. He wanted me. "She's too young," my mother whispered. She was looking at the ceiling, not at him, not at me. "Cyrus, she's a child." "She's 18, the deacon said, smooth and warm. "Older than my Martha was. The Lord makes wives of younger." He folded his long, dry hands. "Think of the alternative, Sister Ashby. Think of the cold." I knelt by my mother's bed that night when he had gone, and I begged her. I'm not ashamed to say I begged. "Mama, please, you know what happened to his wives, you know. Don't give me to him. I'm too young to be a wife. I'm too young to be his wife." And my mother, who had been the gentlest woman I ever knew, turned her face to the wall and could not look at me, and she said, "There's no other road, Cora. He'll see you fed. He'll see you warm. It's a mercy. It's the only mercy left." That was the night I learned that fear can make even a loving heart do a monstrous thing. The joining was set for the following Sunday, 3 days off, quick so that no one could think too hard on it. On the morning of it, the fog came down so thick off the ridges that you could not see the church steps from the gate, a wet white blindness that swallowed sound and shape alike. They dressed me in a gown the color of old cream that had belonged to the deacon's second wife, Martha, and it smelled of cedar, and of something underneath the cedar that I did not want to name. They put me in the little back room of the meeting house to wait, and through the plank wall I could hear the congregation filing in, and the low hum of the deacon greeting them, every voice in that room belonging to a family that owed him their roof. I looked at the small window. It was painted shut, the glass run with fog. Beyond it I could see the dark wall of the laurel where the cleared land ended and the wild ridges began. To go out there in October, in a thin gown with no kit and no skill, was a way to die. I knew it. And then I heard the deacon's boots come heavy across the meeting house floor toward the back room door, slow and certain, a man walking to collect a thing that was already his, and the choice stopped being hard. Slow in his bed or quick in the cold, at least the cold was honest. I broke the window catch with the heel of a fire iron that leaned by the little stove. There was a man's coat hung on a peg, old gray wool, and a cloth bundle on the shelf beneath it that someone had set aside, and I snatched both of them without a thought past need, threw the coat over the dead woman's gown, and shoved myself through the frame as the doorknob turned behind me. I came down hard in the wet leaves and I ran. I ran into the white blindness, toward the black timber, and I did not look back, not even when I heard the first shout go up behind me. By the time the fog burned thin, it had turned to a cold, driving rain, the kind that runs the warmth out of a body like water out of a cracked jug. My slippers were gone, lost in a creek crossing. The gown hung on me heavy as chain mail. I had climbed past the last cornfield, past the last stump, up into a country of wet black rock and dripping laurel where there was no trail at all, only the deer paths that pinch out into nothing. My hands had stopped hurting, which I have since learned is the worst sign there is. Somewhere below and behind me, a dog was baying, and the sound followed me up the mountain like a thing that already knew my name. I do not remember falling. I remember a spring breaking out of a mossy ledge, and the deep wish to lie down beside it, and then the cold leaves against my cheek and the gray light going out at the edges like a lamp turned down. The last thing I heard was not the dog. It was a low, even voice, very near, saying a word I could not make sense of, and then a pair of arms going under me, and the smell of wood smoke and hide. The man who carried me up that mountain was Eli Hatcher, and down in Hollow Creek, they spoke his name the way children speak of the Booger Man. He was a hunter who lived alone above the head of the cove in a cabin no preacher had ever blessed. They said he'd come back from somewhere far and broken, that he'd had a wife and a child once, and lost them both to fever in a single hard winter while he was off working, and that grief had driven him up out of the world of men for good. He came down twice a year to trade hides for powder and salt and coffee, and he did not bow his head when the deacon spoke, and that alone was enough to make the valley sure he was damned. I woke in his cabin in the orange light of a stone hearth, wrapped to the chin in bare hide, and the first thing I saw was him sitting across the room on a low stool, a knife in one hand and a piece of pale wood in the other, peeling thin curls of it into the fire. He was a big man, dark-bearded, with eyes that took in everything and gave back nothing. When he saw me stir, he did not move. "Don't try to talk fast," he said. His voice was low and rough like a wheel on gravel. "You took a chill near to the bone. You'll be slow a day or two." "Are you one of his men?" My own voice came out a cracked whisper. "Did the deacon send you?" He went still, and something crossed his face that was almost a smile and was not kind. "I don't keep with the deacon," he said. "I found you dying under my spring. That's the whole of what I know about you." He turned the wood over in his hand. "Name's Eli Hatcher. You'll have a name too, but it can wait till you can hold a cup." Over that night and the next he kept me alive. He fed me broth off dried venison a spoon at a time. He rubbed the feeling back into my feet with snow he carried in from a high pocket where it had already fallen, working slow so the frostbit toes would not blacken and rot. He asked me nothing. And because he asked nothing, I told him everything: the debt, the wives in the churchyard, my mother turning her face to the wall, the window and the fog and the run. I expected him to pity me. Instead, he listened with his jaw set, and when I was done, he poured a cup of black coffee, set it by my hand, and said, "Soon as you can walk, I'll take you down the far side to the rail town at Marshall. You can buy a ticket out of these mountains and never come back. That's as far as I go. I don't carry valley trouble up this ridge. Not anymore." It stung me more than it should have, that flat dismissal, but I nodded. Beggars do not argue. What I did not know was that the valley trouble had already followed me up his ridge, and it was not finished with either of us. It came the second afternoon. The rain had quit and the woods hung silent and dripping, and into that silence broke the deep belling of a dog working a scent, and then the scrape of shod hooves on rock. Eli was at the door before I understood the sound. He looked through a gap in the chinking, and his hand dropped to the heavy pistol at his hip, and for the first time his face emptied of everything, smooth and cold as river ice. "Stay down," he said. "Don't make a sound no matter what's said." He took up a long rifle from the pegs over the door, an old single-shot buffalo gun near as long as I was tall, broke it open to seat a brass shell the size of my thumb, and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. I crept to the chinking gap and looked. 4 men on mules had stopped at the edge of the clearing, 2 hounds straining and slavering on a rope, and at their head sat a man named Roy Tackett, the deacon's overseer, a square, red-faced brute who broke fingers for the church when the praying did not take. He held a repeating rifle across his saddle. "Afternoon, hermit," Tackett called out. He had a grin on him. "Right cozy way up here, powerful lonesome, though." "It was," Eli said, "till the wind blew trash onto my mountain. Say your piece and clear off, Tackett." The grin slipped. "We're tracking strayed church property. A girl, Deacon Vance's intended, run off from her own joining like a heathen. Dogs say she came up your way." "I don't hold church property," Eli said. "Don't play me, Hatcher. That's the deacon's bride. Hand her down and we'll leave you to rot up here in peace. Hide her, and the deacon brings the whole congregation up this ridge with torches, and they burn you out with the girl inside and call it the will of God." I stood pressed to the cold logs with my heart slamming, and I was sure that Eli would open that door and drag me out by the wrist for the bounty, because what was I to him? He owed me not one thing. He had already saved me twice over. I shut my eyes and waited for the latch. What I heard instead was the buffalo gun coming up to his shoulder. He did not aim at Roy Tackett. He aimed a hair to the side, and the gun went off like a clap of thunder rolling down the cove, and a young oak sapling not a foot from Tackett's ear blew apart into a spray of white splinters and bark. The mules screamed and reared. By the time they came down, Eli had broken the gun, thumbed in a fresh shell, snapped it shut, and laid it dead on the center of Tackett's chest, all in less time than it takes to tell. "The girl stays," Eli said, and his voice rolled out across that clearing like the gun had. "You go back down. You tell Vance the joining's off, and you tell him that the next ball I throw won't go into a tree." Roy Tackett looked at the gun, and at the splintered sapling, and at the man behind the gun, and whatever courage had carried him up the mountain went out of him all at once. He wheeled his mule and spurred it down the trail, and the rest went after him, and the hounds baying faded down the cove and was gone. Eli came back in and set the gun on its pegs. He did not look pleased. He looked like a man doing hard sums in his head. "He'll be back," he said. "Vance can't let it lie. A man rules a valley by fear, and fear's a thing that breaks the first time somebody isn't afraid. He'll come back with the whole congregation. We leave at first light over the back of the ridge before the dogs can work this cold ground." He started pulling kit off the shelves, dried meat, a sack of meal, shells. "You shouldn't have done it," I said. "You should have let them take me. Now he'll kill you too." Eli stopped and looked at me a long moment, and some of the ice in him thawed a degree. "I've buried about all the people I aim to bury," he said quietly. "I'll not hand a girl to a man like Vance to make my own life easy, not while I can still lift that gun." And he went back to packing. We did not get to leave at first light. Just before dawn, while the cabin was still dark and Eli was banking the fire for the walk out, a voice called soft from the edge of the clearing, and it was not a hard man's voice. It was young and gentle, and it knew my name. "Cora, Cora Ashby, it's Tom. Tom Sledden, don't be afraid." My heart leapt up against all sense because I knew Tom. He was the boy who minded the church store near my own age, soft-handed and shy, the one who used to slip an extra biscuit into my flour sack when the deacon wasn't looking and would never take a penny for it. The one kind face in the whole hollow. I was at the door before Eli could stop me, and there in the gray light stood Tom Sledden, hat in his hands, looking up the trail he'd climbed in the dark. "I came to help you get away," Tom said, breathless. I couldn't stand it, Cora, what he was going to do to you. I know a way down to Marshall the dogs can't follow along the creek bed. I can take you both. We have to go now before the congregation gathers. I wanted to believe him so badly that it hurt. But Eli had come up behind me, and he did not lower the rifle, and he was watching Tom sledding the way a hawk watches grass move. "How'd you find this cabin in the dark, son?" Eli asked, easy and quiet. "Ain't a man in that valley been up this ridge in 10 years but Roy Tackett, and he only came yesterday." Tom's eyes flicked, just once, down the trail behind him, and that single flick told me everything before my heart would let it land. I followed the dog's track," Tom said. "From yesterday." "Dogs didn't tree here," Eli said. "Tackett never come to the door. There's no track to follow but the one Tackett left in his own head, and you'd have to have been told it by him to know it." He took a slow step forward. "Who sent you up here, son? And don't lie to me twice." The boy crumbled like wet bread. He could not even cry properly, just stood there shaking, and the truth came out of him in pieces. The deacon had known Tom was sweet on me. He had used it. After I ran, Vance had sat the boy down and told him there was only one way to save my soul and my body both, and that was to win my trust and bring me down off the mountain gentle, where the dogs and the guns had failed. Tom had been the deacon's man the whole way. Every kindness, the biscuits, the soft looks, all of it was a leash, and I had never once felt it around my neck. "He said he'd take care of me if I brought you in," Tom whispered. "He said you'd thank me someday. I didn't, Cora, I didn't think." "No," Eli said. "You didn't." It was Eli who thought to look in the bundle. In all the running I had near forgotten it, the cloth bundle I had grabbed off the shelf in the meeting house back room beside the gray coat. He cut the string and unrolled it on the table by the fire and went very still. Inside was a length of fine brass chain, the kind a surveyor drags to measure land, the links worn bright with use. And folded with it was a small leather field book, swelled and stained with damp. I knew the chain. I knew the book. My hands began to shake before my mind would say why. "That's my father's," I said. "That's Daddy's surveying kit. He had it with him the day I could not finish it." Eli was already turning the soft pages by the firelight, reading the cramped lines of my father's hand, columns of bearings and distances and dates, and then he stopped and read a thing twice and let out a long breath through his nose. "Cora," he said, and his voice had gone gentle in a way it had not been before. "Your daddy wasn't surveying the church land for the deacon. He was surveying it against him. Look here. He's got the true federal lines drawn out, every farm in the hollow, and beside him he's wrote what's on the church deeds Vance has been holding. They don't match. Not one of them. The deacon's been claiming a third more land than any deed gives him, and forging the corners, and no man in that valley could read a survey to know it." He turned to the last written page. "And here's the date your father died. He just finished. He was fixing to take it to the land office in Asheville." He looked up at me. "Your daddy didn't slip on the falls, girl. He found out what Vance was, and Vance couldn't have that book reach the law. That's why this kit went missing the day he died. Vance has had it hid in that meeting house 2 years, and you grabbed it off the shelf going out the window." I sat down hard on the bench because my legs would not hold me. 2 years I had believed the rocks were wet. 2 years I had grieved a clumsy accident. And it had not been the church dead at all, not really. The deacon had not wanted a young bride for his bed. He had wanted the last living Ashby tied to him and silenced, married into the family that could destroy him, before I ever grew old enough to wonder why my father's survey book had vanished. "That's why he had to have me," I said, and my voice came out strange and far away. "Not for a wife, to bury the last of it, to bury me." "And now you know it," Eli said, closing the book. "Which means this stopped being a runaway bride matter the minute I read it. Tom here was sent to bring you down so it could all be quiet again. If Vance gets his hands on you and this book both, there'll be a third grave in that churchyard inside a week, and the valley will pray over it and never ask." He looked at the boy, who had sunk to the floor by the door with his head in his hands. "Question is what we do with you." "I will tell you what we did. Eli was for leaving Tom Sledden tied to a tree for the buzzards, and I do not blame him. But I looked at that boy, who had been a coward and not yet a murderer, who had carried his own shame up the mountain with him whether he meant to or not, and I made the first hard choice of my life that was mine to make. "We take him," I said. "He climbed up here to lead me into a trap. He can climb down to lead us out of one. And when we get to a judge, he can tell every word of it out loud." Eli looked at me a long moment, and something shifted in his eyes that I would later learn was respect. "All right," he said, "but the chain stays around his wrist." We did not run to Marshall after that, to a railway and a ticket and a quiet life somewhere far. We ran for the county seat at Asheville, 2 days hard travel along the high ridges, because Eli knew that a man named Judge Whitfield rode the circuit there, an outside man the deacon held no paper on and no fear of, and because a forged deed and a hidden survey book and a murdered surveyor were exactly the sort of thing a federal judge was bound by his oath to drag into the light. We left at midday with Tom roped between us, and the field book sewn inside Eli's coat against his chest. The deacon did not wait in Hollow Creek for us to come back. When Tom failed to return, he understood that the soft road had failed too, and that I knew everything now, and a man like Cyrus Vance does not survive by being slow. He did not bring torches up Eli's ridge. He guessed our road. He took 30 men of his congregation, fathers and sons of the families he had robbed, who did not know they had been robbed, who believed in their hearts they were chasing a fallen woman and the heathen who had stolen her. And he rode the lower trail hard to get ahead of us. And at the narrows above the old church, where the path pinched between a rock face and a long drop to the creek, he set his trap and waited. We walked into it on the second afternoon, footsore and half-starved, and the only warning we had was a flock of crows that burst up cawing out of the laurel ahead. Eli threw his arm across me and shoved me back against the cold rock wall. "We're funneled," he breathed. "Narrows up ahead, drop on the offside. Best ambush ground on the whole ridge. He's here." And then the deacon's voice came down off the rocks above us, smooth and warm and carrying like a hymn. "Eli Hatcher." There he stood at the top of the narrows, tall and dry in his black coat, 30 men spread along the high ground on either side of him with rifles bristling, blocking the only way through. "Hand down the Ashby girl, and whatever lies she's carried off, and you may walk back up your mountain and live out your wicked days in peace. Refuse me, and these good Christian men will scour you off the face of God's earth and feel righteous doing it." Eli did not waste a word on him. He looked down at me, and I will never forget his face in that moment, hard and certain and somehow gentle all at once. My own face, I knew, had changed since the meeting-house window. The weeping girl in the dead woman's gown was gone, scoured off me by the cold and the climb and the truth in my father's hand. Eli pressed his heavy pistol into my 2 hands and folded my fingers around it. "Get behind the rock," he said. "If a man comes round it that isn't me, you don't think. You aim for the middle of him and you pull. You understand? Eli, there's 30 of them. I've faced worse with less," he said, and gave me a brief crooked smile that did not reach his eyes. "Keep your head down, Cora Ashby." And he stepped out into the open with the buffalo gun coming up. He did not fire a warning this time. The first ball took Roy Tackett clean off the rocks, and then the whole narrows came alive with gunfire, leads screaming off the stone all around me and filling the air with biting rock dust. Eli was a terrible machine, firing and breaking the gun and thumbing a shell and firing again, each great roar of it knocking a man off the high ground, and for a moment I let myself believe we might hold. Then his gun fouled, a grain of grit on the breech in the cold, and in the half-second he spent wrenching at it. A man with a rifle came scrambling around the low rock not 10 feet from his unguarded back, and I saw him level it at Eli's spine. I did not decide to do it. I was simply out from behind the rock with the heavy pistol up in both hands before I knew I had moved, and I remembered Eli's words, "the middle of him," and I pulled the trigger. The gun bucked so hard it near flew out of my grip, and the crack of it went through my whole body. The man spun half around with a red bloom high on his shoulder, dropped his rifle off the edge into the creek far below, and scrambled away howling, his nerve broken by a girl of 18. Eli cleared his breech in that same instant, and his eyes met mine across the smoke, full of a shock that turned at once to a fierce pride. "Good girl," he said, and snapped the gun back up. But 30 men were still 30 men, and they were moving to flank us along the high scree, and I knew with a cold certainty that the buffalo gun could not kill them all. So I did the only thing left that I could do, the thing no bullet could do. I climbed up onto the low rock where the whole congregation could see me and hear me, and I screamed out across that narrows with everything my scorched lungs could give. "He killed my father," I screamed. "Cyrus Vance murdered my daddy on the falls and stole his survey book to hide it, and that book says he forged every deed in Hollow Creek. Your farms aren't his. He's been stealing your land for 20 years and calling it God's will. It's all in my father's own hand, and we're taking it to the judge in Asheville. That's why he wants me dead. Not for any sin of mine, to bury the proof." The gunfire stuttered and died. 30 men of Hollow Creek went still on the rocks, and I watched it move through them like wind through a wheat field, the doubt. And then the memory, every man among them thinking of the cousin who had lost his bottom acres to the church, the uncle prayed off his own grandfather's farm, the corners that never had matched the old maps. They turned their heads slow, and they looked up the narrows at Deacon Cyrus Vance. And the deacon made his single mistake. He should have been silent. Instead, his smooth, warm voice cracked up an octave into something shrill and ugly, and he shrieked, "Lies! Heathen lies! Kill her, kill them both, I commanded in the name of—" "You don't command nothing," said a man named Asap Prophet, whose people had farmed the lower creek for 60 years, and he lowered his rifle off Eli and turned it the other way. And then another did, and another, and the trap the deacon had set closed around the deacon instead. That was the moment the law arrived, though we hardly needed it by then. Judge Whitfield had been riding the high road from Asheville on the circuit, and the gunfire had carried for miles in the cold air, and he came over the eastern ridge with 2 deputies and a federal land agent at a hard gallop. By the time they reached the Narrows, Cyrus Vance was sitting in the dirt with 30 of his own congregation standing over him, and Asap Prophet was holding the man's own pistol on him, and nobody in Hollow Creek would meet the deacon's eye anymore. It was not all victory. I will not pretend it was. They took the field book to the land office, and the federal agent confirmed every word of it, and the forged deeds were thrown out one by one, and the land of Hollow Creek went back to the families it had been stolen from. They tried Cyrus Vance for the murder of my father, and for the deaths of his 2 young wives, which a doctor at last was made to look into. And he was hanged for it in the spring. Tom Sledden told every word of his part out loud to the judge, as I had said he would, and the judge gave him 3 years for his trouble, which was mercy, and Tom took it like a man at last. But my mother did not live to see the truth set right. She passed in the 2nd week of my running, before I could get word back down to her, before she ever knew that her husband had been murdered and not lost to a wet rock. I have made my peace with it by telling myself she died believing she had at least kept me from the cold. I hope that comforted her. I will never be sure. When it was over, when the deeds were filed and the rope was tied, and there was nothing left of the girl who fled the meeting house window, but the woman who stood in the Asheville land office holding the deed to her own father's bottomland, I walked out into the street and found Eli Hatcher standing by the rail, his buffalo gun over his shoulder and his face turned toward the high blue ridges to the west. He was getting ready to go back up the mountain, back to the cabin and the spring and the long silence, alone the way he had been when I crawled into his life half dead. He had said his piece to the judge and signed his name where it was wanted, and that, I understood, was the end of what he reckoned he owed the world. I had reached into my coat pocket on the long walk down, somewhere on that last ridge, and found a thing there I had not known he'd put. It was a small bird carved out of pale wood, a wren with every feather cut fine, the same wood I'd watched him peel curls off into the fire that first night when I thought he was the booger man come for me. I held it in my hand now in the street, warm from my pocket. "You're going back up," I said. It was not a question. "It's where I belong," he said. "Quiet up there. A man can hear himself think." He looked at the wren in my hand and something moved behind his beard. "Keep that. to remember the mountain didn't take you. I was 18 years old. I had a deed to good land and a free road in front of me, and the whole rest of my life to spend any way I chose, and I had earned every inch of it. I looked up at that big, silent, broken man who had asked nothing of me and risked everything for me, and I made the last hard choice of that long autumn, and it was the easiest one of all. I told a dying woman once that I was too young to be a wife, I said, and I was. I was too young to be Cyrus Vance's wife, or any man's wife who'd take me like a sack of seed corn. I closed my fingers around the little wren. But I think I'm just about old enough to walk a mountain, if somebody'll show me the trail. Eli Hatcher looked at me for a long, long moment, and then a smile came up slow out of all that silence, the first true one I ever saw on him. "It's a hard place, the mountain," he said. "Cold half the year, lonesome the other half." "Then it could use one more voice," I said. We left Asheville the next morning with the deed folded in my coat and the wren in my hand, walking up toward the high blue ridges where the fog was just then lifting off the hollows, and below us, for the first time in 20 years, the valley of Hollow Creek belonged to the people who lived in it. I never did go back to the world of men down there, but I have never once been sorry for it, and I have never again been afraid of the cold.